Hi, this is Grandma here, and I am reading It's a Jungle Out There by Ron Snell, and this will be my last chapter to read, chapter 16. And it's a continuation of chapter 15. Chapter 15 was about the road to Yaranakata to Tingo Maria, which was a very bumpy road, a very primitive road, and going up and down through the passes in the Andes, which were it's a very high mountain range. They had hoped to have a nice shower by the time they got to Tingo Maria, but there was only cold water. The other thing that is important to note is that the car keeps breaking down. They have been lucky so far to have been able to make repairs or find somebody who could make the repairs. But meanwhile, chapter 16, we're going from Tingo Maria to Lima. And they want to go to Lima because from Lima they will be taking an airplane to the United States, where they will be for a year, visiting family and catching up and visiting churches and doing the kinds of things that missionaries do when they are on furlough. Chapter 16, Tingo Maria to Lima, and the photo gives us a hint as to what's going to happen on this section of their road trip. Dad woke up wondering just what would break down next. I'm going to find some place to get the car fixed. Eat breakfast and get your stuff packed so we can shove off as soon as I get back. Shove off. Had to have been a throwback to Dad's life in the Navy, but it seemed rather appropriate for this car. Oh, can't we stay here another day and play? Melody begged. I'm tired of riding in the car. Let's do something funner. She wasn't being specific, but almost anything would have been funner than getting back in the smelly car. They're working on the road right now, so we've got to get over the pass to Huanacu today while the traffic's going in our direction. Otherwise, we'll have to wait 2 more days. Dad didn't realize how appealing that sounded to the rest of us. Still, we were well behind schedule, so we would have to press on. Dad wandered the streets of Tingo looking for someone with the right parts to fix our steering linkage. None of us particularly wanted to see how long his belt would last. We shivered through breakfast on the veranda and packed up our increasingly dirty gear. In between bites and bags, we floated leaf boats in the river. Come look at the sleeping lady, Mom urged us. With the help of our vivid imaginations, we stared up at her, a ridge of mountains that looked sort of like the face, bust, belly, knees, and toes of a woman lying on her back. She looked blue with cold, but at least she was sleeping better than Mom had. After the customary prayers for safety, obviously urgent, wisdom, we should have given this some thought before we said we'd take the car, and no more car breakdowns, a miracle, in other words. Our day started out following a river much like the Boquerón in miniature. The steering linkage was working perfectly again. Lush green cliffs crowded us against the drop-off beside us, but gave sensational views of white water cascading over a boulder-strewn valley. Once out of the river valley, we climbed in earnest, spinning back and forth as we followed the switchbacks ever upward. If the Rapture used this route, it would take years to get us all in heaven. Switchbacks is that's where the road goes back and forth, kind of like an S or a Z. You don't want to go straight down the mountain. You would be going too fast and your brakes would burn. So what you do is you go down very gradually. So you start up here and you go, and those are called switchbacks when you do that. Okay. All right. Aren't the tea gardens beautiful? They're so green. You just want to stare and stare. Mom was obviously sitting in the front seat. In the back seat, we were greener than the tea gardens, and staring at plants was pretty low priority. You kids need to learn to appreciate this stuff, Dad tried. Think how many kids never get a chance to do this. We thought all those unknown kids were particularly lucky today. In many places, the road was not only torn up from construction, it was so steep that stopping might mean we couldn't get started again. Low clouds swirled around us, reducing visibility to a couple 100 feet and keeping the road and everything else damp and cold. It would be a terrible place to meet a stopped truck. We met a stopped truck. "What's wrong with it?" Melody asked, as if the rest of us somehow magically would know. "I think he's broken down," Sandy answered. Sandy would magically know most anything. Fortunately, the driver's helper had placed a rock behind each wheel to keep him from rolling back into our laps. Mom didn't think the rocks looked very secure, so she once again tightened her grip on her casket. The rest of us got out to stretch and to breathe uncontaminated air. Our breath blew out in white clouds. "Que paso?" Dad asked a pair of dirty shoes sticking out from under the transmission. "My clutch is slipping," came the Spanish answer from 5 feet in front of the shoes. "I'll have it adjusted en un momentito. Momentito, it's originally meant in a short moment. Here in the mountains, it could mean minutes or even years." Within less than a momentito, our teeth chattered, our bodies shivered, and our lips turned blue. We were only too happy to hear the truck engine roar back to life, coughing and backfiring while it cleared its throat. "Climb aboard," Dad yelled. He clearly wanted us to be together as a family when the truck with its slipping clutch rolled over us. Nevertheless, aboard we climbed, warmed by the exhaust fumes that gushed our way. The driver raced his engine a dozen times, blasting us with more clouds of hot smoke. He let off the parking brake, and the truck rolled perceptibly backwards against its rock chocks. "Something's burning." Terry was the first to say it, but we all smelled the pungent smoke. It was by now unusual to smell anything but ourselves. "It's his clutch," Dad answered. Through the haze that enveloped us, we heard the gears growl angrily. The heat of the snarling engine washed over us, and finally, heavily, the truck crawled up the hill to a chorus of blue-lipped cheers. "Jump out and get those rocks out of the road," Dad ordered as he started our car and put it in gear. That would mean Terry and me, since we had bullied Sandy into the middle of the back seat. We jumped as told, cleared the road, and scrambled back in. Our car wasn't breathing too well in the thin air. 2 of the 8 cylinders had sore throats and coughed regularly. We all wondered just how we would manage the 16,000 feet pass if we could barely manage this 10,000 feet summit. Still, we were moving in the right direction and within a few kilometers passed the truck with the burnt clutch. The driver, in a rare fit of wisdom, had pulled over at a wide spot and called it quits. Rocks again placed firmly behind each wheel. Once over the summit, where we saw nothing but the cloud that surrounded us, it was a long downhill coast to Huanacu. Trucks used low gears and backfired as if they were shooting at each other. Going down was no faster than going up. Huanaco, the day's ordeal, was almost over. In minutes, we would be at a nice hotel, finally able to eat and bathe. Without notice, we all heard a loud banging and scraping at the front of the car, as if someone were cutting the engine out with a skill saw. "Now what?" Mom asked in a voice that was ragged with exhaustion. Mom could never sleep in a car, and since she couldn't sleep too well in hotels either, this had been a long trip. Dad pulled over, unfolded himself into the cold, and lifted the hood. Our radiator fell out. The fan blade kind of chewed it up. At least it hadn't taken long to diagnose the problem this time. Steaming water spurted on the concrete bridge as our car bled to death. This time we were at least within shouting distance of our hotel. We limped in, dejectedly ejected, and paid for rooms. Dressed and wrapped in anything that looked warm, the impression we gave was that 6 bales of used clothing had just arrived for recycling. "What are we doing for supper?" The restaurant in the hotel was already closed, and we were close to starvation. "Let's go find some chicken," Dad suggested. Reluctantly, we all dragged our bundled warmth stiffly back outside, hugging ourselves like forlorn orphans. The car, waterless now, at least got us to a warm supper and delivered us back to our tourist hotel. "There's no hot water," Mom confirmed, what we all had come to expect by now. "Let's just go to bed and bathe in the morning." In the mountain air, we could at least add layers of clothing on top of those that were starting to ferment underneath. In the morning, of course, there wasn't any hot water. Dad left on a solitary trek to find another radiator. The rest of us shivered and packed. This day would make or break us. Everyone who knew anything about the road to Lima had given us the same warning. "Whatever you do, don't spend the night in Cerro de Pasco. If you stay there, you'll get sriracha and you'll freeze to death. There is no good place to stay there anyway. It's just a mining town." Sriracha was the dreaded altitude sickness that made heads pound and stomachs wrench. At 15,000 windswept, treeless feet above the sea level, Cerro de Pasco was high on our list of miserable places to miss. Of course, you already know what's coming. By the time Dad got back to report that the radiator had at least temporarily been soldered, we were well past our planned departure time. Prudence would have suggested laying over for a day. Prudence wasn't along on the trip. Off we went, coating ourselves with a fresh layer of dust and exhaust as we climbed higher into the Andes. "Look at the llamas," Melody said from her privileged front seat position. "Aren't they pretty?" We all straightened from our slouches to see a colorfully decorated herd of them crowding the road in front of us, each carrying a small bundle. Behind the herd, a Quechua man and his wife trotted, their leathery faces and hands parched from cold lives in the mountains. The wife's 4 or 5 multicolored skirts swayed rhythmically as she loped along, carrying her baby, cocooned in a blanket on her back. She spun wool on a hand-carved bobbin. Throughout the day, we would see more llamas, sheep, alpacas, goats. Not that they would do us any good. The travel bingo cards that a friend in the U.S. had sent us didn't include llamas and alpacas. Throughout the day's climb, our engine griped and complained. Powerless without oxygen, it barely kept us moving. At one particularly steep climb, somewhere around 14,000 feet, it finally refused to go a foot further, succumbing to sriracha even before we did. The road was so steep that it would have been a challenge in the lowlands. Up here, we were totally stuck. We would all have gotten out and pushed, but in the thin air, we had no more energy or strength than the car. Several times we backed down the slope to a slightly more level spot and raced forward, engine sputtering, tires spinning in the loose gravel. Every time the result was the same, a pathetic, whimpering whine and engine failure. About to give up, Dad finally had an inspiration. "Let's try it backwards. I think the gearing is lower in reverse." His Model T days had included similar tactics in steep hills. It was no small feat getting the car turned around on this narrow road, but when we finally had, the result was a screaming, rattling, clutch-riding, weaving backward ascent. Sir Edmund Hillary couldn't have been more elated. Sir Edmund Hillary is a famous mountain climber. By evening, sriracha and car sickness were pounding us. Dad had no relief driver. The landscape was bleak and barren. A freezing wind rocked the car. All warnings aside, we would have to spend the night in Cerro de Pasco. "I'll see if they'll let us stay at the mining camp's guest house," Dad moaned. "Perhaps they'll take pity on us." They didn't normally let anyone stay in the guest house but employees. He returned gray and tired and shaking with cold and exhaustion. "They said we can have one room. We can only put 4 of us in it, so you 2 will have to sleep in the car." He was looking at Terry and me, and we reluctantly resigned ourselves to a night in the freezer. With no appetite for supper, and none available anyway, we all covered ourselves with every available fabric and tried to sleep away the headaches and dizziness. Terry and I were roughly awakened by a blast of cold air at 3 a.m. It was Dad, carrying Melody. "Scoot over so Sandy and Melody can get in. If I don't get out of here now, I'm afraid I won't be able to drive." We scooted and they piled, and miraculously the car started. Not for long. By the time we'd reached the remote outskirts of Cerro, a brilliant red warning light told us the car was overheating, of all things. It had to be the only overheated thing within 200 kilometers. Dad hurried to open the hood, blue-faced and panting at the exertion of just getting to the front of the car. The radiator, of course, was frozen. An overheated engine right behind a frozen radiator. Life is full of ironies. If ever we were desperate, now was the time. A rapidly deteriorating driver, an already deteriorated car, Arctic air without oxygen. We were all silent, wondering what would happen to us. "Give me a flashlight," Dad ordered through clenched teeth. "I've got to find some water to pour over the radiator." It was amazing that the beam from the flashlight didn't get blown away by the wind as he searched the side of the road. "Hey, there's a faucet here. Give me a pan." With no pan readily available, our little enamel potty would have to do. He turned on the faucet. In a moment of pure compassion, God had kept the water from freezing in the pipe when it froze in our radiator. A couple dozen trips and dumps were all it took to thaw the radiator and freeze Dad's hands. He leapt in and we roared off with a fresh understanding of God's special provision. By the time the sun came up, we listed rather badly to starboard. A spring shackle had broken in the pre-dawn blackness, and that would be not the season spring, a spring in the car. Surrounding us with loud and bumpy banging. When daylight finally came, we could pull into a house turned junkyard beside the road. One look at the odd assortment of long dead cars and trucks left no doubt that we would find nothing to match our American import. Still, Dad climbed out. "Do you have a spring shackle that would fit this car?" he asked the puzzled, rosy-cheeked old man in the bright yarn pullover. The bright pullover disappeared into the heaps, returning months later with a huge smile and just what we needed. He handed it to his son and explained to Dad that he wanted his son to get some mechanical experience. We weren't as thrilled as he was at his son's unexpected opportunity to learn a new trade. When the sun hadn't made any visible progress in an hour, Dad could wait no longer. "Here's 50 soles, he said, feeling quite generous at giving the failing son $3.30. "I'll finish putting it on." By the time we drove away, everyone was happy. The other father, because his son had learned something, the son, because he'd gotten paid for doing nothing, and our father, because we had just found the right spring shackle in the middle of nowhere. We could be on our sprung way once again. The rest of the trip was an altitude-induced blur. We took turns vomiting out the window or into the potty. We could barely appreciate the asphalt road that signaled our 3-hour descent into Lima, especially since it speeded up the never-ending switchbacks and increased the car sickness. When we finally pulled up at our group's guest house, we felt like refugees just back from a week foraging at the town dump. Someone swung open the double doors that would let us into the interior parking area. It took a few moments to realize that it was over. For 5 days, we had averaged 10 miles an hour. We hadn't bathed the whole trip. Our lips were chapped, the sides of our mouths and the sides of the car covered with dried vomit. The air inside was thick with fumes and smells from us and the overflowing potty. Somewhere along the way, we'd given up emptying it. "Welcome to Lima House," the cheerful, clean voice outside the car said. "We were beginning to wonder what had happened to you. Did you have a good trip?" Bleak, gray-green stairs all around, no answers. Finally, coming to our senses, we tried to get out. My door, the back right, wouldn't open. Terry's, the back left, was equally stuck shut. Mom's, the front right, didn't budge. And so we exited for the last time, all climbing over the seat, scooching past the steering wheel, and tumbling through the driver's door. We never set foot in that car again. A gracious answer to our prayers. Okay, that's the end of the book, but there is an epilogue that I'm going to read. And an epilogue means what happened later. Our first 10 years in the jungle weren't exactly boring, but we really put our guardian angels through the paces during my high school years. By then we were old enough to have some real fun. That's when I got my horse that screeched to a halt every time I urged her to go faster, and when I built the huge go-kart that we couldn't steer, and paddled down the Urubamba and ukulele with friends in an overloaded dugout canoe for 2 weeks, and spent 5 weeks in a totally isolated little village, surviving on manioc roots and building a useless airstrip. Of course, I'll never forget the time our car broke down in the middle of a landslide on the edge of a cliff, and we raced to see if we could dig it out of the mud before the road eroded right out from under us. But that's another book. Okay, well, that was a fun book. So it does say here, The Ronnie Adventures Book 1. So I guess you need to find Book 2 if you want to read more about their adventures. Bye-bye.